The courtroom fell silent as Judge Theodore Harlan looked down at Elijah Carter, an elderly black man fighting for his family's 3 acres, land held since emancipation, now coveted by powerful developers. Justice? Harlan scoffed at Elijah's tearful plea. In here, it's the law that wins. The gallery's laughter cut deeper than the dismissal itself. But as courthouse security ushered Elijah toward the exit, the doors swung open. Amara Langston entered, her presence commanding immediate attention. Harlan's smirk vanished when she placed a sealed file on the clerk's desk and announced an emergency motion based on suppressed evidence. Harlan had spent decades hiding his crimes behind a gavel, until today when the daughter of one victim and the savior of another finally connected the dots that would bring his world crashing down. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The morning air carried the sharp scent of rain and determination as protesters gathered outside the Jefferson County Courthouse. Their signs bobbed like buoys in a turbulent sea. End police brutality. Justice now. Black Lives Matter. News vans lined the curb, reporters with microphones poised, hungry for sound bites from the day's high-profile police misconduct hearing. But this wasn't Elijah Carter's fight. Not today, anyway. The 78-year-old man moved slowly past the crowd, unnoticed and unassuming. His weathered hands clutched a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to his father. Inside were yellowed deeds, family photographs, and handwritten letters, the paper trails of generations. Elijah's arthritis made each step painful, but determination straightened his back as he climbed the courthouse steps. Inside, the marble halls echoed with footsteps and whispers. Elijah checked the docket, confirming his case. Carter vs. Brightwell Development. Room 305. Judge Theodore Harlan presiding. While Elijah waited on a hard wooden bench outside the courtroom, Judge Harlan was already reviewing his case file in chambers. At 62, Harlan had the cold confidence of a man who had never lost a fight. That mattered. His silver hair was perfectly trimmed, his black robe pressed and pristine. A framed portrait of himself with a former president hung prominently on his wall. "Your Honor, the Carter case is up first," said Linda Williams, his clerk, placing a thin folder on his desk. "It's gotten some attention from community organizers." Harlan didn't look up. "The land dispute with Brightwell?" he scoffed. "Another emotional plea against progress. The plaintiff is representing himself," Linda added hesitantly. "Of course he is." Harlan closed the file with a smack. "Let's get this over with." When courtroom 305 filled, the energy shifted tangibly. On one side sat 3 attorneys from Brightwell Development in crisp suits, laptops open, legal assistants at the ready. On the other side sat Elijah Carter alone, his best Sunday suit slightly too large for his thinning frame. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Theodore Harlan," announced the bailiff. Harlan swept in, his expression already set in stone. After the formalities, he gestured to the plaintiff. "Mr. Carter, you may present your case." Elijah stood slowly, joints protesting. "Thank you, Your Honor." His voice was soft but clear, carrying the deep cadence of rural Georgia. "I'm here today because Brightwell Development is trying to take my family's land. 3 acres on Willow Creek Road." "And you have a deed, I presume?" Harlan asked, impatience already creeping into his tone. "Yes, sir. I have the original grant from 1867. Elijah reached into his briefcase. "This land was given to my great-grandfather, Moses Carter, after emancipation. My family has lived there for—" "Mr. Carter," Harlan interrupted, "this court doesn't need a history lesson. Do you have documentation that meets current legal standards? Brightwell's filing shows a clear chain of title. Their chain is based on forged documents, Your Honor." Elijah's hands trembled slightly. "If you look at the dates—" "Objection," called Jeffrey Wilson, Brightwell's lead attorney. "The plaintiff is making unfounded accusations." "Sustained," Harlan said without hesitation. "Mr. Carter, stick to facts, not emotions." A few people in the gallery chuckled. Elijah felt heat rise to his face but pressed on. "Sir, My family's history is facts. We have 5 generations buried on that land. There's a family cemetery that... Irrelevant. Harlan waved dismissively. Cemeteries can be relocated. Brightwell has already offered to cover those costs. Elijah's voice cracked. You can't relocate our history, Your Honor. That land was promised. Mr. Carter, Harlan's voice sharpened. This court deals with present-day legal statutes, not promises made during Reconstruction. Brightwell has submitted proper documentation showing they acquired this property through legal channels. But if you'll just look at these papers, Elijah fumbled with his briefcase. The court has reviewed all necessary documentation. Harlan cut him off. Brightwell Development has demonstrated clear title to the property in question. Their permits are in order. The development project has been approved by the county commissioner. But they never even looked at my deeds, Elijah protested, desperation edging into his voice. The judge's expression hardened. Mr. Carter, have you filed these documents properly with the clerk of court? I tried, but they said I needed. A simple yes or no will suffice. Elijah's shoulders sagged. No, Your Honor. Harlan nodded as if this confirmed everything. Then I have no choice but to rule in favor of Brightwell Development. This court finds that the plaintiff's claim lacks legal merit. The injunction against development is dissolved effective immediately. The gavel came down with finality. Elijah stood frozen, disbelief washing over him. What about justice, Your Honor? The words escaped before he could stop them. What about what's right? A humorless smile curved Harlan's lips. Justice? In here, it's the law that wins, Mr. Carter. And the law says Brightwell owns that land now. Scattered laughter rippled through the courtroom. One of the Brightwell attorneys smirked. Court is adjourned, Harlan announced, already gathering his papers. Elijah remained standing, tears welling in his eyes. The bailiff stepped forward. Sir, you need to exit the courtroom. But I didn't even get to show my evidence, Elijah whispered. The bailiff took his arm, guiding him toward the door. Sorry, but that's how it goes sometimes. As Elijah shuffled out, clutching his briefcase of useless papers, he heard the excited murmurs behind him. Court spectators and reporters had shifted their attention from him to something, or someone, else. See who just walked in? One reporter whispered to another, nodding toward the courtroom doors. Elijah turned, curious despite his heartbreak. A tall black woman in her late 30s entered the courtroom. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged anywhere she chose to be. Her dark suit was impeccably tailored, her natural hair styled in a professional twist. 2 younger attorneys flanked her, carrying leather document cases. But it was the folder in her own hands that caught Elijah's attention, a sealed file with bold lettering. Carter versus Harlan, 1987. The woman's eyes swept the room, landing first on Elijah with a flicker of recognition, then moving to Judge Harlan, who had frozen in the act of standing. The courtroom fell silent. Harlan's confident smirk vanished, color draining from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. The woman walked directly to the center of the courtroom. Judge Harlan, she said, her voice carrying without effort. We need to talk. Harlan found his voice, though it had lost its authority. Court is adjourned, Ms. Amara Langston, Your Honor. She didn't smile. Lead counsel for the Southern Justice Coalition. She turned to the court clerk, handing over a thick document. I'm filing an emergency motion to stay this ruling based on previously suppressed evidence. We're calling for an immediate retrial. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Harlan's gavel banged frantically. This is highly irregular. You can't just barge in. Actually, I can, Amara countered, her voice cutting through the chaos, especially when new evidence suggests judicial misconduct dating back decades. She held up the sealed file. Evidence that connects directly to this case. Reporters were already rushing from the room, phones to their ears. The Brightwell lawyers huddled in urgent conference. And Elijah Carter stood watching, wondering who this woman was and why she had appeared like an avenging angel at his darkest moment. The flames licked hungrily at the small wooden house, crackling and roaring as they consumed everything in their path 12-year-old Elijah Carter raced toward the burning structure, ignoring his father's shouts behind him. "Someone's still inside," a neighbor had screamed, pointing to an upstairs window where a small figure could be seen pounding on the glass. Without hesitation, Elijah had bolted forward. The heat slapped against his face as he burst through the front door, dropping low, to avoid the worst of the smoke. The stairs groaned dangerously under his feet as he climbed. Following cries for help, he found himself in a small bedroom where a section of ceiling had collapsed. Beneath the rubble, pinned but conscious, lay a little girl no more than 7 years old. Her terrified eyes locked onto his. "I've got you," Elijah promised, pushing aside burning debris. He ignored the pain as splinters and hot wood bit into his hands. With one decisive movement, he scooped her up and turned back toward the stairs. The journey out was a blur of heat, smoke, and determination. As they burst into the fresh air, the girl clutched tightly around his neck. Neighbors swarmed around them. Someone took the child from his arms as Elijah collapsed onto the grass, coughing violently. The last thing he remembered was the little girl looking back at him from her mother's arms, her eyes wide with gratitude and something like wonder. Now, 30 years later, Elijah stood outside the Jefferson County Courthouse, trying to process what had just happened inside. The woman, Amara Langston, was speaking with reporters, her voice steady and powerful. "Today we witnessed a continuing pattern of judicial misconduct," she was saying. "The Southern Justice Coalition will be presenting evidence that Judge Harlan has systematically stripped black landowners of their property through biased rulings for decades." When the press conference ended, she walked directly to where Elijah waited. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Amara Langston." Her handshake was firm, her gaze direct. Up close, Elijah noticed a small scar near her left temple, barely visible unless you were looking for it. "Thank you for what you did in there," Elijah said, confused but grateful. "But I don't understand. How did you know about my case?" A small smile curved her lips. "I've been tracking Judge Harlan's cases for years. Yours isn't the first travesty of justice I've seen in his courtroom. But that file you had, Carter versus Harlan, that was from 1987. That would have been your father's case," Amara finished for him. "Harold Carter sued Judge Harlan's father, who was also a judge, for racial discrimination in a property dispute." Elijah's eyes widened. "I remember that. My father lost everything. The stress killed him. Within a year." "I know," Amara said softly. "And I want to thank you, Mr. Carter." "For what?" "I just lost my case." "Not for today." Her voice softened. "For what you did a long time ago, rushing into a burning house to save a little girl." Elijah stared at her, the memory suddenly crystallizing, the scar near her temple. "That was you?" She nodded once. "You never knew my name. My family moved away right after. But I never forgot yours." Before Elijah could process this revelation, a commotion arose at the courthouse entrance. News cameras swiveled as Judge Harlan emerged, surrounded by courthouse security and his legal team. He hurried down the steps without comment, his face set in a rigid mask. "What happens now?" Elijah asked, watching Harlan disappear into a waiting car. "Now we fight," Amara replied, "and this time we have the evidence to win." The media frenzy that followed was unlike anything Elijah had experienced. By evening, his case was the lead story on local news stations. By the next morning, it had gone national. The headlines varied. Civil rights attorney takes on corrupt judge, historic land grab exposed, judge accused of decades of discrimination. But all featured Elijah's stunned face and Amara's determined one. Brightwell Development issued a terse statement claiming they had acquired the land legally and were reviewing the situation. Construction permits were temporarily frozen pending the emergency hearing Amara had demanded. 3 days after the courtroom confrontation, Micah Reed sat at his desk at the Atlanta Tribune, scrolling through property records. At 32, Micah had already built a reputation for uncompromising investigative journalism focusing on systemic injustice. The Carter case had caught his attention immediately, not because it was sensational, but because something about it felt too familiar. This isn't just about one piece of land, he muttered, printing another document. His corkboard was already covered with photos, timelines, and property maps. A pattern was emerging, one that sent chills down his spine. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Micah Reed," he answered. "Mr. Reed," came a woman's voice. "My name is Amara Langston. I think we should talk." While Amara was gathering allies, Elijah returned to the land that had been in his family for generations. The 3 acres sat just outside the expanding city limits. Once considered worthless, now prime real estate as the suburbs sprawled outward. The modest house where he'd grown up had long since fallen into disrepair after his wife, Ruby, passed 5 years ago, but he still maintained the small cemetery at the far edge of the property. Elijah walked slowly among the headstones, some proper marble markers, others simple wooden crosses that he replaced whenever they weathered too badly. His parents, Harold and Beatrice Carter. His grandparents, Joseph and Mary. His great-grandparents, Moses and Sarah. And Ruby, his wife of 50 years, whose absence still ached like a phantom limb. "I'm trying," he told her silent stone. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to fight them, but I'm trying." The wind rustled through the oak trees that shaded the graves. Elijah closed his eyes, listening. Sometimes, if he was very still, he could almost hear Ruby's voice in the leaves. What Elijah didn't know was that Amara was uncovering a darkness with roots as deep as his family tree. In her downtown office, she spread documents across a conference table while explaining to Micah Reed what she'd discovered. "It started in the 1980s when Theodore Harlan was a prosecutor," she said, pointing to newspaper clippings. "He used his position to pressure black families to sell land cheap. Those who refused faced mysterious tax problems, building code violations, even criminal charges." "And the judge who heard those cases?" Micah asked. "His father, William Harlan." Amara laid down a black and white photograph of an older white man in judicial robes. The family business was justice, or their version of it. "How did you get onto this?" Amara hesitated. "Let's just say I have a personal connection to the Carter family." Before she could elaborate, her phone buzzed with a security alert. The surveillance camera outside her office showed 3 men in dark suits examining her car in the parking lot. "Looks like we've got their attention," Micah observed. "Good," Amara replied, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her concern. Later that evening, as Amara walked to her car, she found all 4 tires slashed. A note was tucked under the wiper blade. "Drop this or he dies like the rest." She photographed the note without touching it, then called the police. As she waited in the darkened parking lot, she received a text from an unknown number. "We need to meet. I can help. I." The next morning, a young black man in his early 30s sat across from Elijah at a small diner on the outskirts of town. His eyes, so like Ruby's, were skeptical behind stylish glasses, but his handshake was firm. "Thanks for meeting me, Grandpa," Isaiah Carter said, setting a laptop on the table between them. 3 years without a word, and now you show up because of the news." There was hurt beneath Elijah's gruff tone. Isaiah looked down. "I know. I should have come back after Grandma's funeral. I just couldn't." "Your grandmother understood you better than anyone," Elijah said softly. "She kept all your letters. Even read me the ones where you said you were too busy to visit." Shame crossed Isaiah's face. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Elijah studied his grandson, the corporate haircut, the expensive watch, the life so different from his own. "What changed your mind?" "I saw you on the news." Isaiah opened his laptop, and then I started reading Grandma's old letters that I'd saved, the ones where she talked about the land and what it meant. He turned the screen so Elijah could see it. "I'm a data security analyst. I know how to find things people try to hide." On the screen was an encrypted financial document. "This took me all night to crack," Isaiah explained. "It's a trust agreement for something called Harlan Family Holdings. The beneficiaries include Judge Theodore Harlan, and the company owns a 15% stake in Brightwell Development. The judge has a direct financial interest in taking your land." Elijah stared at the screen. anger and vindication washing over him in equal measure. He sat in judgment on his own case. That's illegal. It's worse than that, Grandpa. Isaiah scrolled to another document. I found evidence of at least 20 other cases where he did exactly the same thing. This isn't just corruption, it's systematic theft. Elijah looked at his grandson with new eyes. Have you shown this to Amara Langston? Not yet. I wanted to come to you first. Isaiah closed the laptop. I should have been here all along. I want to help now, if you'll let me. Elijah reached across the table, placing his weathered hand over his grandson's. There's always been a place for you here, son. Always. As they left the diner, neither noticed the black sedan parked across the street, nor the man inside taking photographs of them both. Meanwhile, Judge Harlan sat in his private study, a glass of bourbon in his trembling hand. Spread before him were old newspaper clippings, court transcripts, and a faded photograph of a burned house from 1992. He drained the glass, then reached for his phone. Garrett, it's Ted. We have a problem. She's back, and she remembers everything. The morning light filtered through dusty blinds in the cramped office of the Riverside Community Center. Sarah Wilson methodically sorted through assistance applications, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun. At 34, she had devoted the last decade of her life to helping families navigate housing crises and government assistance programs. The work was demanding but purposeful. Her colleague, James, poked his head around the doorframe. You see the news this morning? That big case against Judge Harlan is blowing up. Sarah's hand stilled over the paperwork. What case? James tossed a newspaper onto her desk. Some elderly black man's land dispute. Turns out the judge has financial interest in the development company that's trying to take the guy's property. It's getting ugly. Sarah stared at the newspaper photo. Judge Theodore Harlan exiting the courthouse, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. A face she knew all too well, though she had worked very hard to ensure he wouldn't recognize hers if they passed on the street. You okay? James asked. You look like you've seen a ghost. Sarah forced a smile. Fine. Just remembered something I need to take care of. After James left, she locked her office door and opened her bottom desk drawer. From beneath a stack of folders, she removed a small wooden box. Inside was a birth certificate with 2 names. Mother, Diana Wilson. Father, Theodore Harlan. Sarah Wilson was born Sarah Harlan, the judge's biracial daughter, hidden from public view her entire childhood, then rejected entirely when she became too difficult to explain away. She'd changed her surname legally at 18, cutting all ties with her father. Now his sins were front-page news, and painful memories she'd buried for years bubbled to the surface. She tucked the birth certificate away. A part of her wanted to see him destroyed for what he'd done, not just to the man in the news but to her mother, to her, and to countless others. Another part feared what exposing that connection might do to the life she'd carefully built. Her phone vibrated with a news alert. Judge Harlan had issued a statement denying all allegations and calling the lawsuit a politically motivated attack. Sarah laughed bitterly. Even now he was lying. Across town, Micah Reed hunched over his laptop in the newspaper's research room. Stacks of property records from the county assessor's office surrounded him like a paper fortress. His editor, Frank Davis, peered in with a concerned expression. You've been at this for 2 days straight. Find anything? Micah looked up, eyes bloodshot but bright with discovery. More than something. I found a pattern. He gestured to a large map pinned to the wall, red markers dotting specific areas. In the last 30 years, 43 black families have lost land in Jefferson County, and 38 of those cases went through Judge Harlan's court. Frank whistled low. That's not coincidence. It gets worse. Micah pulled up a spreadsheet. I've cross-referenced the locations. Every single parcel was later developed by one of 3 companies, all subsidiaries of Brightwell Development. Jesus. Frank rubbed his chin. This is big, Reed, like career-defining big. It's not about my career. Micah's voice hardened. My grandfather lost his auto shop to eminent domain in 1992. The city claimed they needed it for a public works project. 2 months later, It was demolished for a Brightwell shopping center. Frank nodded slowly. Take whatever resources you need. Just make sure everything is airtight. These people will come after you hard. Let them, Micah replied, turning back to his documents. Meanwhile, in the Jefferson County Courthouse, a young black public defender named Camille Rivers stood at the copy machine, discreetly scanning court records. At 29, she was the youngest attorney in the public defender's office, known for her meticulous preparation and fierce advocacy. She'd been watching Judge Harlan's courtroom for years, helpless against his systematic discrimination against her clients. When Amara Langston visited the courthouse that afternoon, Camille accidentally bumped into her near the restrooms. Ms. Langston, I'm Camille Rivers. She slipped a flash drive into Amara's hand. Security cam footage from Harlan's courtroom. Last 6 months, there's a pattern of coaching the bailiff to intimidate certain defendants. Amara smoothly pocketed the drive. Why are you helping? Camille's eyes flashed. Because last year my client got 15 years for a crime that white defendants typically get probation for in Harlan's court. I've been collecting evidence ever since. You're risking your job. Some things matter more. Camille straightened her blazer. Check folder B. There's footage of Harlan meeting privately with Brightwell executives after hours. Before Amara could respond, footsteps approached. Camille quickly stepped away, resuming her professional demeanor as a senior prosecutor walked past. That evening, Elijah and Isaiah sat in Amara's office reviewing the growing mountain of evidence. A knock at the door interrupted them. Amara's assistant, David, entered, looking uncomfortable. There's someone here to see you. Says he's Garrett Brightwell. Amara raised an eyebrow. The CEO himself? Show him in. Garrett Brightwell swept into the room with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. At 55, his silver-flecked hair and tailored suit projected power and privilege. Ms. Langston, he began without preamble, this situation has gotten out of hand. I'm here to offer a solution. Mr. Brightwell, Amara replied coolly, I don't recall scheduling a meeting. I don't typically need appointments. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I'm prepared to offer Mr. Carter 3 times the market value for his property. This ends today. Everyone wins. Elijah stood, his dignity unwavering. My family's history isn't for sale. Brightwell's gaze didn't shift from Amara. This isn't just about 3 acres of land. It's about the future of this city. Progress doesn't wait for sentiment. No, Amara countered. It's about legacy. Yours and the Harlans. Systemic land theft disguised as legal business. Something dangerous flashed in Brightwell's eyes. Be careful, counselor. You're playing a game with rules you don't understand. Is that a threat? Isaiah stepped forward. A reality check. Brightwell straightened his already perfect tie. The land will be developed. The only question is how much pain you want to endure before accepting the inevitable. After he left, Amara's phone rang. It was Micah. Someone broke into my apartment, he said without greeting. They took my laptop and backup drive. Amara's grip tightened on the phone. Are you safe? Yeah, I'm at a friend's place, but there's more. I got a tip about a private cemetery being bulldozed on the north side. When I got there, it was just an empty construction site. The source had given me the wrong address. They're feeding us false information, Amara realized. Someone inside is leaking our movements. The investigation continued despite the setbacks. While Amara and her team gathered evidence, an unexpected ally emerged from within the courthouse itself. Frank Thompson, known to everyone as Frankie, had worked maintenance at the Jefferson County Courthouse for 15 years after serving 2 tours in Afghanistan. His position made him practically invisible to the judges and lawyers who passed him daily, which is how he'd witnessed so many things he wasn't supposed to see. One evening, as Isaiah worked late in Amara's office, a text came through from an unknown number. Loading dock. 20 minutes. Come alone. Against his better judgment, Isaiah went. In the shadows of the courthouse's rear entrance stood a middle-aged black man in gray maintenance coveralls. You Isaiah Carter? The man asked gruffly. Isaiah nodded cautiously. Name's Frankie. I worked with your grandmother once. Church, fundraiser for veterans. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. Security camera footage. Judge Harlan and his clerk replacing evidence in your grandfather's case file the night before the hearing. Isaiah stared at the drive. Why are you helping? Us? Pain flashed across Frankie's weathered face. My brother lost his farm to Brightwell in 2010. Judge Harlan presiding. Derek drank himself to death 6 months later. He pressed the drive into Isaiah's hand. Some debts need paying. As Isaiah turned to leave, Frankie added, Tell Ms. Langston to look into Harlan's study in his home. Word is he keeps a vault there. Everything's in it. The deeds, the bribes, all of it. How do you know that? Cleaned his office for years. Man gets loose-lipped when he thinks you're just furniture. Frankie melted back into the shadows. Be careful. These people play for keeps. Meanwhile, Sarah Wilson sat in her apartment, surrounded by old letters and photographs. Her mother had kept everything, birthday cards signed only with the initial T, money orders for child support, and the rare photographs of young Sarah with her father, always taken in private, always hidden from public view. For 3 days, she'd watched the case against her father unfold in the news. The evidence was damning: financial conflicts of interest, manipulation of court records, a clear pattern of discriminatory rulings. Part of her wanted to stay hidden, protected from the fallout. But another part, growing stronger by the hour, needed to act. She opened her laptop and created a new email account. After staring at the blank composition page for nearly an hour, she finally typed to amara.langston.southernjustice.org. Subject: Judge Harlan's vault. I know about the safe in Ituine. Theodore Harlan's study. It contains evidence of all his crimes. Land deeds, payoff records, everything. I can help you access it. I'm someone who knows the house well. This must remain anonymous for now. She hesitated, then pressed send. The next day, as Amara was reviewing this mysterious email, Elijah sat in her office watching recently uncovered footage from 1963. His father being arrested for trespassing on his own land. The officer making the arrest was William Harlan, Theodore's father, before he became a judge. It's been the same family all along, Elijah whispered, his voice breaking. 3 generations of Harlans taking from 3 generations of Carters. Amara placed a hand on his shoulder. And we're going to end it, Mr. Carter. Micah rushed in, clutching a stack of papers. I found it. The key to everything. He spread the documents on the table. Judge Harlan used fake psychiatric reports to declare black landowners mentally unfit to maintain their property. Once, declared incompetent, the court would appoint a guardian for their assets, always someone connected to Brightwell. That's not just corruption, Amara said, scanning the reports. It's systematic erasure, using the legal system to eliminate an entire community's claim to their heritage. It's genocide by paperwork, Micah agreed grimly. And no one noticed because it happened one family at a time, over decades. As they processed this devastating revelation, none of them noticed the small listening device planted beneath Amara's conference table, transmitting every word back to Judge Harlan's private study. The hammer fell with devastating speed. 3 days after discovering the falsified psychiatric reports, Amara received a certified letter from the State Bar Association. She was being investigated for professional misconduct, and her license was temporarily suspended pending a formal hearing. The evidence against her was a recording of what appeared to be Amara offering a bribe to a court clerk for confidential documents. The audio had been expertly edited from multiple conversations, creating a damning false narrative. With her law license suspended, the emergency hearing for Elijah's case was postponed indefinitely. Brightwell Development wasted no time announcing they would resume preparation work on the property while legal technicalities were being resolved. They can't just do this, Isaiah protested as the team gathered in Amara's now closed office. The recording is obviously fake. They can and they did, Amara replied, her calm demeanor belying her anger. The system protects its own. Always. Has Micah paced the room. We need to get the truth out. I'll write the story. And who will publish it? Amara asked. Brightwell's parent company owns your newspaper and half the media outlets in the state. As if confirming her point, Micah's phone buzzed with a text from his editor. Story killed by publisher. Meeting tomorrow to discuss your focus. The coordinated attack continued. That evening, every major news channel in the city ran stories, questioning Amara's ethics and motives. Carefully edited clips showed her appearing to harass witnesses and manipulate evidence. Her past cases were suddenly under scrutiny, with anonymous sources suggesting patterns of misconduct. The public that had rallied behind Elijah's cause just days earlier now viewed his champion with suspicion. Protest numbers dwindled. Organizations began distancing themselves. 2 days later, police arrested Micah at his apartment, charging him with illegal access of government databases. The warrant cited specific timestamps and server addresses, all fabricated, but convincing enough to justify holding him for questioning. While being processed at the station, Micah was surprised to see Camille Rivers waiting for him in the interview room. I don't handle criminal cases, he said, confused. I'm not here as a public defender, she replied, keeping her voice low. Amara sent me. Don't say anything to anyone. The charges are bogus, but they're hoping you'll incriminate yourself during questioning. How did they even know what I was researching? The courthouse network is compromised. They've been monitoring all database searches related to property, records. Camille slid a paper across the table. Sign this. It's a statement asserting your Fifth Amendment rights. I'll post your bail within the hour. Outside Amara's apartment, media vans had created a virtual blockade. Reporters shouted questions as she tried to enter her building. Ms. Langston, how do you respond to accusations that you fabricated evidence? Were you paid to target Judge Harlan? Is it true you're being investigated for witness tampering in previous cases? Amara pushed through without comment, her face a composed mask that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. Inside, Isaiah waited with mounting concerns. Brightwell crews started marking survey lines on my grandfather's property this morning. We tried to stop them, but they had police escorts. Amara's phone rang. Elijah calling. Ms. Langston. His voice sounded defeated. Maybe we should let this go. They're too powerful. My father fought them. I'm fighting them. Nothing changes. Mr. Carter. They'll destroy you too, he continued. Your career, your reputation. All for 3 acres that they'll take anyway. Elijah, Amara said firmly, using his first name for the first time. Look at me. She switched to video call. They're fighting this hard because they're terrified. We have them cornered. What's the point? The weariness in his eyes cut her, deeply. They'll always win. Not this time, Amara promised. Everything will change, starting now. After hanging up, she turned to Isaiah. We need to draw a line. If they start actual construction, we'll never get the land back intact. What can we do without your license? Amara's expression hardened. Sometimes the law isn't enough. Sometimes you need the truth to be so loud they can't ignore it. Across town, Sarah Wilson watched Elijah's defeated interview on the evening news. The elderly man's pain as he described generations of injustice struck something deep within her. They took my father's dignity, Elijah said on screen. They're taking my land, but they can't take our truth. Sarah made her decision. That night, she drove to her father's sprawling mansion on the outskirts of town. As the judge's estranged daughter, she still knew the security codes. He'd never bothered to change them, so certain was he that she would never return to the place that had confined her for 18 miserable years. The house was dark and silent. Judge Harlan was at a fundraising dinner downtown. Sarah had confirmed his schedule through social media posts. Moving silently through the familiar halls, she made her way to his study. The wall safe was hidden behind a painting of William Harlan, her grandfather, a man whose cold eyes had always frightened her as a child. The combination hadn't changed either. 12/15/49, her grandfather's birthday. Inside the safe was exactly what she'd hoped to find. A leather binder filled with documents, a stack of land deeds with notations in her father's handwriting, and The bottom, a sealed envelope labeled H. Carter, 1963. Sarah's hands trembled as she photographed everything, careful to replace each document exactly as she'd found it. As she was finishing, headlights swept across the driveway. Her father was home early. She slipped out through the service entrance, heart pounding, clutching her phone with its precious evidence. In her haste, she dropped a hairpin near the study, so a small mistake that would have enormous consequences. The next morning, a plain envelope arrived at Amara's office with no return address. Inside was a flash drive and a note. From a friend. Use it wisely. The drive contained photographs of dozens of documents, including something explosive, a signed confession from William Harlan, Theodore's father, admitting to fabricating evidence against Harold Carter in 1963 to seize the family's land. The confession had been written in 1987, shortly before William's death, entrusted to his son with instructions to make amends. Theodore had buried it, instead continuing his father's corrupt legacy. This is it, Amara breathed. Proof of multi-generational conspiracy. She immediately contacted a journalist she trusted at the Washington Post, someone beyond Brightwell's influence. By that evening, the confession was headline news nationwide. Civil rights organizations that had stepped back amid Amara's scandal surged forward again with renewed outrage. Protesters returned to the courthouse in greater numbers. The mayor, sensing a shift in political winds, called for an official inquiry into Judge Harlan's court. Brightwell Development responded with escalation. Private investigators began following. Elijah, Isaiah, and Amara. Their phones showed signs of hacking attempts. Their homes were photographed by unmarked vehicles. Then came violence. Frankie, the courthouse maintenance worker who had provided the security footage, was attacked in an alley behind his apartment. Two men in masks beat him severely, sending him to the hospital with broken ribs and a fractured skull. In his hospital room surrounded by the team, Frankie managed a pained smile. "Worth it," he whispered. "My brother can rest easier now." The attack backfired spectacularly. When news broke that a whistleblower had been assaulted, public sentiment erupted. Thousands gathered outside the courthouse, demanding Judge Harlan's immediate removal from the bench. State and federal authorities could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. The Bar Association expedited their review of Amara's case, quickly discovering the fabricated nature of the allegations against her. Her license was reinstated with a formal apology. Amara wasted no time. The day her suspension was lifted, she strode into the Jefferson County Courthouse, flanked by a team of attorneys from the Southern Justice Coalition and the ACLU. Behind them walked Elijah Carter, standing taller than he had in weeks, and behind him marched hundreds of supporters. The emergency hearing was rescheduled. Judge Harlan was forced to recuse himself, replaced by a federal judge brought in specifically for the case. As Amara prepared her opening statement, a court officer approached with a sealed envelope. "Just delivered for Judge Harlan," the officer explained. "But you should see it first." Inside was a federal subpoena. Theodore Harlan was to be investigated for corruption, racial bias, abuse of judicial power, and conspiracy against civil rights. Amara looked up to see Harlan receiving an identical envelope across the courtroom. For the first time since she'd known him, fear replaced arrogance in his eyes. He knew what was coming, not just the loss of his position, but potentially his freedom. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed Amara. One shouted above the others, "Ms. Langston, is it true the FBI is now involved?" She smiled slightly. This case was never just about 3 acres of land. It's about justice delayed for generations. And yes, this is now a federal investigation into one of the most extensive judicial corruption schemes in state history. As cameras flashed, Elijah stood quietly to the side, watching the woman who had changed everything. He thought of his father, who had died believing justice was impossible. He thought of his wife, Ruby, who had always insisted truth would eventually prevail. "You were right, Ruby," he whispered. "You were right all along." That evening, as Elijah and Isaiah walked the perimeter of their land, marking the family cemetery with fresh ribbons to protect it from any further Brightwell intrusions, Isaiah asked the question that had been bothering him. How did Amara know about all this? Why did she pick your case specifically? Elijah smiled. Some debts can't be measured in dollars, son. Some get paid across lifetimes. He pointed to an old oak tree at the edge of the property. When that girl was 7 years old, I pulled her from a burning house not far from here. Turns out saving a life creates a bond that doesn't break easy. Meanwhile, in Judge Harlan's mansion, the once powerful man sat alone, a glass of scotch, trembling in his hand. On his desk lay the federal subpoena alongside a newspaper featuring a photograph of Amara Langston on the courthouse steps. His phone rang, Garrett Brightwell calling. "This is your mess, Ted." Brightwell's voice was ice. "Fix it or we all go down." Harlan stared at the subpoena. "There's nothing I can do now. She has everything." "There's always something," Brightwell replied. "Find it, or I'll make sure you're not the only Harlan who suffers." The threat hung in the air as Harlan realized Brightwell knew about Sarah, his greatest shame and potentially his final downfall. The morning of the federal hearing dawned with an electric tension hanging over the city. By 6 a.m., crowds had already begun forming outside the federal courthouse, a grand marble building that stood in stark contrast to the county courthouse, where Elijah had first faced Judge Harlan. News vans lined the perimeter, satellite dishes pointed skyward, broadcasting the unfolding drama to viewers across the nation. This is Catherine Bennett reporting live from the federal courthouse, where what many are calling the trial of the century is set to begin in just a few hours, announced a reporter, her perfectly styled hair whipping in the morning breeze. Behind me, hundreds have gathered to witness the historic confrontation between civil rights attorney Amara Langston and Judge Theodore Harlan, a case that has exposed decades of alleged judicial corruption and racial discrimination. Inside, a hotel room 6 blocks away, Elijah Carter adjusted his tie in the mirror. The Navy suit, purchased specially for this day, fit better than the old one he'd worn to his first hearing. Isaiah stood behind him, pride evident in his eyes. "You ready, Grandpa?" Elijah took a deep breath. "Been ready for 60 years, son." When they arrived at the courthouse, the crowd parted respectfully, many reaching out to touch Elijah's shoulder or murmur words of support. Near the entrance, Amara waited with her legal team, 6 attorneys representing various civil rights organizations that had joined the case. Her reinstatement had transformed the proceedings from a simple land dispute into a sweeping indictment of systematic judicial abuse. "Mr. Carter," she greeted him warmly. "Today, we make history." Inside, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Federal Judge Mary Ann Taylor, brought in from Washington, D.C. specifically for this case, had a reputation for absolute integrity. At 68, her no-nonsense approach and meticulous attention to detail had made her a legend in legal circles. As the bailiff called the court to order, a side door opened, and Judge Harlan entered with his legal team. Gone was the imperious confidence that had once defined him. Though impeccably dressed as always, his complexion had a grayish tinge, and his shoulders curved slightly inward, the unconscious posture of a man under siege. Behind him sat Garrett Brightwell with Brightwell Development's corporate attorneys, an AA wall of expensive suits and carefully neutral expressions. Judge Taylor wasted no time on preliminaries. This court recognizes the gravity and public interest of these proceedings. However, I will not tolerate grandstanding, media plays, or unnecessary delays. We are here to determine 3 matters: the rightful ownership of the property in question, the alleged misconduct of Judge Theodore Harlan, and the potential conspiracy involving Brightwell Development. Ms. Langston, you may begin your opening statement. Amara rose, her presence commanding the room without effort. Your Honor, this case began as one man's fight to save 3 acres of land. But as evidence mounted, we discovered something far more sinister: a multi-generational conspiracy to systematically strip black landowners of their property through judicial fraud, falsified documents, and abuse of power. She gestured to Elijah. Elijah Carter's family has lived on and worked their land since 1867, when it was granted to his great-grandfather after emancipation. For over 150 years, They have buried their dead there, raised their children there, and created a legacy there. Judge Theodore Harlan attempted to erase that legacy with a stroke of his pen, just as his father did to Elijah's father and his grandfather before him. Amara walked closer to the judge's bench. We will prove that Judge Harlan has financial interests in Brightwell Development, making his rulings in their favor a direct conflict of interest. We will show a pattern of similar rulings against black landowners spanning decades. And most disturbingly, we will expose the use of falsified psychiatric evaluations to declare black property owners incompetent so their land could be legally seized. Judge Harlan's attorney, William Bradford, a bulldog litigator known for defending powerful clients, delivered a rebuttal painting Harlan as a dedicated public servant being smeared for following the law. Brightwell's attorneys depicted the company as an innocent purchaser that relied on the court's determination of legal ownership. As opening statements concluded, Amara announced her first witness. The plaintiff calls Sarah Wilson. A murmur swept through the courtroom as a composed, professional-looking biracial woman walked to the witness stand. Judge Harlan visibly flinched, his face draining of what little color remained. After Sarah was sworn in, Amara began gently. Ms. Wilson, would you please state your full name for the record? Sarah took a deep breath. Sarah Diana Wilson, born Sarah Diana Harlan. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Taylor banged her gavel once. Continue, Ms. Langston. Ms. Wilson, what is your relationship to Judge Theodore Harlan? Sarah looked directly at her father for the first time in over 15 years. He is my biological father. And could you tell the court why you changed your surname? Objection. Bradford was on his feet. This witness's personal history is irrelevant to the land dispute. Your Honor, Amara countered, Ms. Wilson's testimony goes directly to Judge Harlan's character and establishes a pattern of behavior relevant to the case. Judge Taylor considered briefly. I'll allow it, but keep it focused, counselor. Sarah straightened in her seat. I changed my name because Judge Harlan, my father, spent my entire childhood hiding me from public view. My mother is black. Having a biracial child didn't fit the image he wanted to project. Her voice remained steady as she detailed a childhood of secrets, being kept away from public functions, introduced as a family friend's daughter when necessary, and ultimately sent to boarding school when she became too difficult to explain. When I was 16, I found documents in his study, records of land disputes involving black families. There were notations about using psychiatric evaluations to have owners declared incompetent. Sarah paused. When I confronted him, he told me, "This is how the world works. Some people aren't meant to own what they can't properly maintain." Bradford's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned Sarah's motives, suggested she was seeking revenge for childhood grievances, and tried to discredit her memory of documents she'd seen as a teenager. Sarah never wavered. I have spent my adult life working with families facing housing discrimination and displacement. This isn't about revenge. It's about stopping a cycle that has destroyed countless lives, including my own. As she stepped down, she didn't look at Judge Harlan again. Next, Isaiah took the stand, presenting the forensic financial evidence he'd uncovered. With clinical precision, he traced money from Brightwell Development through shell companies and, finally, to Harlan Family Holdings, a trust benefiting Judge Harlan directly. In the past 30 years, Isaiah explained, displaying charts on a large screen, Judge Harlan has ruled in favor of Brightwell Development or its subsidiaries in 47 separate land disputes. In each case, he had a financial interest in the outcome. During cross-examination, Brightwell's attorneys attempted to portray the connections as coincidental and remote. Isaiah countered by revealing detailed financial transfers with timestamps and account numbers, leaving no room for interpretation. When Elijah Carter finally took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. At 78, he carried himself with quiet dignity, his voice soft but unwavering as he recounted not just his own story, but generations of his family's history. My great-grandfather Moses was born enslaved, he began. After emancipation, he received that land as part of the Southern Homestead Act. He built the first house with his own hands. My grandfather Joseph expanded the farm. My father, Harold, maintained it through the Depression. Elijah described finding his father slumped over their kitchen table in 1963, clutching a court order giving him 30 days to vacate the property, after being declared mentally unfit by William Harlan, then a county judge. The stress killed him, Elijah said simply. He died believing he'd failed his father and his children. The land had eventually been returned to the family through a settlement in the 1970s, only to face new threats when Brightwell development began expanding into the area. As Elijah spoke, the courtroom remained completely silent. Even reporters held their questions. When he finished recounting the recent hearing where Judge Harlan had mocked his tears, several jurors were visibly moved. Bradford, sensing the emotional impact, kept his cross-examination brief and technical, focusing on property laws rather than Elijah's personal story, a strategic error that only highlighted the cold, procedural approach that had enabled the injustice. After a lunch recess, Garrett Brightwell took the stand, his demeanor a study in controlled arrogance. Immaculately dressed and media-trained, he projected confidence and dismissive charm. Brightwell. Development has a 30-year history of revitalizing communities, he declared. We purchase properties through legal channels, following all applicable laws. We rely on the courts to determine legitimate ownership. Amara's cross-examination was surgical. Mr. Brightwell, are you aware that your company has acquired 43 properties from black owners in Jefferson County alone, all through Judge Harlan's court? We don't track the race of property sellers, Brightwell replied smoothly. Amara displayed a map showing Brightwell's acquisitions outlined in red, all clustered in historically black neighborhoods. An interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say? Brightwell shifted uncomfortably. We develop where opportunity exists. And did opportunity exist because your company donated $2 million to Judge Harlan's re-election campaigns over the past 20 years? Objection. Bradford was on his feet. Withdrawn, Amara said calmly, but the damage was done. She continued, Mr. Brightwell, can you explain these photographs? On the screen appeared historical photos of Elijah's family on their land during the 1960s. In the background of several images, partially obscured but identifiable, were men in Brightwell Company uniforms, watching the property. I can't explain those, Brightwell stammered. Let me help, Amara offered. These men were surveillance, monitoring properties targeted for acquisition, before any legal proceedings began. Your company wasn't responding to opportunity. Mr. Brightwell, you were creating it. Brightwell's composure cracked. The development of this region requires difficult decisions. Not everyone can participate in progress. And who decides who participates? Amara pressed. His answer hung in the air like a confession. People who understand the big picture. The next witness arrived in a wheelchair, still recovering from his attack. Frankie Thompson testified about court documents he'd seen Judge Harlan altering late at night, security footage that mysteriously disappeared, and conversations he'd overheard between the judge and Brightwell executives. My brother lost everything to them, Frankie said, his voice rough with emotion. His land, his dignity, eventually his life. When I got the maintenance job at the courthouse, I started watching, listening. I knew someday someone would need to know what I'd seen. As the day's testimony concluded, Micah Reed's bombshell article, The Plantation in a Pinstripe Suit, was published online by the Washington Post. It detailed the nationwide implications of the case, connecting the Jefferson County land seizures to similar patterns in 5 other states. The article went viral instantly, trending across social media platforms and drawing national attention to the hearing. The second day of proceedings began with a surprise. Retired court clerk Janet Marshall took the stand, testifying that Judge Harlan had instructed her to lose certain filings from black landowners contesting development orders. She produced a journal detailing dates, cases, and specific instructions spanning 15 years. I should have spoken up sooner, she admitted, her hands trembling. I was afraid of losing my pension. But watching Mr. Carter on the news, I couldn't stay silent anymore. By midday, public sentiment had shifted so dramatically that crowds Outside, the courthouse had doubled, with protesters demanding Judge Harlan's immediate removal from the bench. National civil rights leaders arrived to stand with Elijah Carter, transforming the case into a rallying point for a larger movement against systemic discrimination. The breaking point came during Amara's direct examination of Judge Harlan himself. After methodically walking him through evidence of financial connections, contradictory rulings, and documented meetings with Brightwell, she confronted him with the signed confession from his father regarding the 1963 seizure of the Carter property. Judge Harlan, did you receive this document upon your father's death in 1987? I don't recall, Harlan replied stiffly. It's addressed to you specifically, instructing you to make things right with the Carter family. Did you read these instructions from your father? My father left many papers. Amara persisted, her questioning becoming more direct until Harlan's legendary composure finally shattered. These properties were never meant to stay in their hands anyway, he shouted, gesturing toward Elijah. Do you think my grandfather fought to maintain a certain social order just to watch it be dismantled? These people were never meant to own land like that. The courtroom froze in shocked silence. Judge Taylor's gavel cracked like thunder. This court will have order, but the damage was irreversible. Harlan's outburst had revealed the true foundation of decades of legal decisions, naked prejudice, and a belief in racial hierarchy. Before proceedings could continue, the courtroom doors burst open. Federal marshals entered, approaching the bench with documents in hand. After a brief hushed conversation with Judge Taylor, they moved directly to Judge Harlan. Theodore Harlan, announced the lead marshal. You are under arrest for conspiracy against civil rights, judicial corruption, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. As the marshals led Harlan away in handcuffs, cameras flashing, the crowd outside erupting in cheers that penetrated the courtroom walls, Elijah Carter sat quietly, watching the man who had tried to erase his family's legacy being erased himself from the bench he had dishonored. Judge Taylor called a recess until the following morning. As the courtroom emptied, Amara found Elijah standing alone by the window, looking out at the crowds below. Mr. Carter, are you all right? He turned, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. My father died thinking no one would ever know the truth. My wife, Ruby, always said someday the truth would matter again. He placed a weathered hand on Amara's shoulder. Thank you for making her right. The ripples from Judge Harlan's arrest spread quickly, touching systems and lives far beyond the original case. Within 72 hours, the State Judicial Commission announced a comprehensive review of all 1,247 rulings issued by Judge Harlan during his career. Special emphasis would be placed on the 126 land dispute cases involving minority property owners. This isn't just about one judge or one piece of land, explained Commissioner Diana Wells at a press conference. It's about restoring faith in our judicial system. Every case tainted by bias or corruption undermines that faith. A special task force comprised of independent attorneys, civil rights advocates, and property law experts began the painstaking process of revisiting decades of potentially fraudulent rulings. Class action lawsuits were being prepared on behalf of families who had lost land, homes, and businesses through Harlan's court. For Brightwell Development, the consequences were swift and devastating. As news of Garrett Brightwell's testimony spread, major investors began distancing themselves from the company. The stock price plummeted, losing 40% of its value in a single week. Project partners pulled out of deals, banks froze credit lines, and regulatory agencies announced investigations into the company's business practices across multiple states. Garrett Brightwell himself was indicted for conspiracy, fraud, and witness tampering in connection with the attack on Frankie Thompson. Security camera footage had captured a meeting between Brightwell and the men later identified as Frankie's attackers, a meeting Brightwell had denied under oath. When FBI agents arrived at Brightwell's mansion with a search warrant, they discovered shredded documents, wiped hard drives, and evidence that key company records had been destroyed in the days following Harlan's arrest. Prosecutors announced additional charges of obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence. The empire is collapsing, Micah told Amara over coffee one morning, showing her the latest financial reports. Brightwell's board is trying to force him out to save the company, but it may be too late, 40 years of corrupt business built on stolen land, and it all came down in less than 2 weeks. Sarah Wilson, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a media storm. After her testimony became public, requests for interviews flooded in from national networks, magazines, and documentary filmmakers. After careful consideration, she agreed to one exclusive interview with PBS, where she spoke candidly about her experiences as the invisible daughter of a powerful man. "My father maintained 2 worlds," she explained to the interviewer. The eyes public world, where he was the respected Judge Harlan, champion of law and order, and the private world where he hid his biracial child and participated in the systematic displacement of black families. The interview resonated deeply across the country, sparking discussions about hidden racism in institutions and the personal costs of systemic discrimination. Sarah used the platform not to dwell on her past, but to announce the formation of the Reclamation Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping displaced families recover their property and history. "This isn't about me," she insisted. "It's about dozens of families who lost more than land. They lost their connection to their history, their ancestors, their identity." One warm afternoon, 2 weeks after Judge Harlan's arrest, Elijah stood alone in the small family cemetery on his property. The old headstones, some professional marble, others handmade with care, marked 6 generations of Carters who had lived and died on this land. He knelt slowly beside Ruby's grave, placing fresh wildflowers against her headstone. "We won, love," he said softly. "Not just the land. They wanted to take our name, our history, everything we were. But we got it all back." From a canvas bag, he removed a small oak sapling. With careful precision, he dug a hole near the cemetery's edge, positioned the young tree, and gently packed soil around its tender roots. "This is for all of you," he told the silent stones, "for those who never lived to see this day." As Elijah worked, he didn't notice the car pulling up his long driveway, or the woman who watched him for several minutes before approaching. "Need some help with that tree, Mr. Carter?" Amara asked gently. Elijah smiled, wiping his hands on his jeans. "It'll grow strong here. Good soil." Amara nodded, looking around the peaceful cemetery. "I've been meaning to come out here, to this spot specifically." She hesitated. "I never really thanked you properly." "For what?" Elijah looked puzzled. "For saving my life." She gestured toward the distant horizon where the remains of a burned house could still faintly be seen. "I buried that memory for years. When this case came across my desk, something about your name triggered fragments I couldn't place." She knelt beside him, helping to firm the soil around the sapling. "I started having dreams about fire, about being trapped. Then I found an old newspaper article about the fire with your name mentioned. Everything came back." "Life has a way of coming full circle," Elijah said quietly. "I became a lawyer because I wanted to save people," Amara admitted. "I never realized I was trying to repay a debt to someone whose name I couldn't even remember." They sat in companionable silence, the young tree standing as testament to both past and future. Across town, Camille Rivers sat in the office of District Attorney Monica Palmer, nervously awaiting the reason for this unexpected meeting. "Ms. Rivers," Palmer began, "your work in exposing Judge Harlan's misconduct has been noted at the highest levels. We'd like to offer you a position as Assistant District Attorney in our Civil Rights Division." Camille blinked in surprise. "That's a significant promotion. You've earned it. Your courage in coming forward with evidence, despite risks to your career, shows exactly the kind of integrity we need." Camille considered the offer carefully, remembering the clients she'd watched Judge Harlan railroad over the years, the ones she hadn't been able to help within the constraints of a broken system. "Thank you, but I need to decline," she said. Finally, Palmer looked surprised. "May I ask why?" "Because I can do more good outside the system than within it." Camille straightened her shoulders. "I'm joining Amara Langston and Sarah Wilson to form a legal coalition focused on wrongfully convicted defendants and victims of judicial misconduct. We've already identified 70 cases requiring immediate review." Palmer nodded with newfound respect. The door remains open, Ms. Rivers, should you change your mind. I appreciate that, Camille replied. But this is where I'm meant to be. Micah Reed's byline had become one of the most recognized in American journalism virtually overnight. His detailed exposé on the Harlan Brightwell conspiracy had earned him the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting, an honor he accepted with characteristic humility. This story found me. I was just lucky enough to listen, he told the audience at the award ceremony. The real heroes are people like Elijah Carter, who never stopped fighting for truth even when no one was listening. The success hadn't changed Micah's fundamental approach to journalism. He remained focused on uncovering systemic injustice, turning down lucrative offers from major networks in favor of continuing his work at the newspaper, now under new ownership after Brightwell's parent company was forced to divest its media holdings. In a private hospital room across the city, Frankie Thompson received an unexpected visitor. Though still recovering from his injuries, he sat up when Elijah entered, carrying a small potted plant. "Mr. Carter," Frankie greeted him warmly. "Didn't expect to see you here." "Wanted to thank you properly," Elijah replied, placing the plant on the windowsill. "Not many would have risked what you did." Frankie shook his head. "My brother Derek was a proud man. Owned that auto shop for 30 years before they took it. The day he had to hand over the keys, something in him just broke." Elijah nodded, understanding all too well. "I brought you something else." He placed an envelope on the bed. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I never had the honor of meeting your brother, but I know we shared the same fight. What you did by coming forward helped bury my father as a free man in spirit. Even though he didn't live to see this day, our families and all the others lost more than property. We lost pieces of our history, our identity, our future. But because of people like you, willing to stand for truth, we've reclaimed something even more valuable than land, our dignity." With deepest gratitude, Elijah Carter Frankie read the letter, twice, eyes glistening. "Thank you," he said simply. "This means everything." Spring turned to summer, and the rebuilding began, not just of structures but of community. On a bright Saturday morning, volunteers gathered on Elijah's property. The local AME church had organized the effort, bringing together people of all ages and backgrounds. Isaiah coordinated the work teams, directing the reconstruction of the old family home that had fallen into disrepair. Architects had drawn plans that honored the original structure while adding modern amenities. Young children ran through the tall grass, playing games and planting flowers along the newly cleared paths. "Your grandmother would love this," Elijah told Isaiah as they watched the activity. "She always said this land needed the sound of children again." Isaiah nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. Finally he managed, "I should have been here sooner. All those years wasted." "Nothing's wasted if you learn from it," Elijah replied. "Look around. This is happening because you came back. Your skills, your knowledge of technology, you found the evidence that broke everything open." As noon approached, Sarah Wilson arrived with food donated by local restaurants. She had become a regular visitor to the property, finding unexpected, healing and helping restore what her father had tried to destroy. "The first families get their settlements next week," she told Elijah as they set up tables under the oak trees. "The task force has validated 28 claims so far." "And Judge Harlan?" Elijah asked quietly. "Pleaded guilty to reduced charges, in exchange for testimony against Brightwell and others. He'll serve at least 5 years. Sarah arranged plates with methodical precision. "He tried to contact me from jail. I declined." Elijah placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Some bridges can't be rebuilt. That's not your burden." As the community gathered to share the meal, Amara stood slightly apart, watching the scene with quiet satisfaction. Her phone buzzed with messages from other attorneys handling similar cases now emerging across the country. The Jefferson County case had opened floodgates, exposing parallel schemes in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, and beyond. She was about to join the gathering when she noticed a figure watching from the road, a woman in her 60s, hesitating as if unsure whether to approach. Amara recognized her immediately from research photos. Diana Wilson, Sarah's mother. Amara walked quietly to Sarah, pointing toward the road. "I think someone's here to see you." Sarah followed her gaze, freezing when she recognized her mother. They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, their relationship another casualty of the secrets and pain surrounding Judge Harlan. With uncertain steps, Sarah moved toward the road. Diana Wilson stepped forward, and for a long moment, mother and daughter stood facing each other in silence. Then, without words, they embraced. A raw, heartbreaking, healing moment that seemed to embody all that had been lost and found in this long journey toward justice. Later that evening, as the volunteers departed and the property grew quiet, Amara sat with Elijah on his newly rebuilt porch. The setting sun cast long shadows across the land that had been fought for, lost, and reclaimed across generations. "The Justice Department called today," she said. "They've offered me a federal judgeship." Elijah raised his eyebrows. "Quite an honor. I turned it down." Amara smiled at his surprised expression. "My place isn't behind the bench. It's on the battlefield, standing with people like you. We're not done yet, not by a long shot." She handed him a folder containing news clippings about similar cases emerging nationwide. "This was never just about 3 acres in Jefferson County. It's about a reckoning that's long overdue." As darkness fell, Elijah rocked gently in his chair, listening to the night sounds of the land: crickets, distant frogs, the rustle of leaves in the old oak trees. These were the sounds his ancestors had heard, the rhythms of a place that recognized its true stewards despite paper deeds and legal machinations. "We'll be ready," he said softly. In his downtown apartment, Micah Reed was putting the final touches on a documentary titled Land of the Stolen. Using footage, interviews, and historical records gathered during the case, he had created a powerful narrative tracing the Carter family's struggle within the larger context of land theft across America. Netflix had already acquired the rights, planning a global premiere that would bring the story to audiences worldwide. The documentary ended with Elijah planting the oak sapling in his family cemetery, a symbol of roots that ran too deep to ever truly be severed. As Micah reviewed the final cut, his phone rang with an unknown number. Normally, he would let it go to voicemail, but something prompted him to answer. "Mr. Reed?" came an unfamiliar voice. "My name is James Taylor. I'm a lawyer in Greenwood, Mississippi." The man sounded both excited and cautious. "I've been following your reporting on the Carter case, and I think I've found something Mr. Carter should see." "What kind of something?" Micah asked, reaching for a notebook. "A deed from 1869. It mentions Elijah Carter's grandmother as co-owner of several properties across multiple counties, properties that were supposedly sold off decades ago." Micah sat up straighter. "How did you find this?" The lawyer hesitated. "Let's just say some old courthouse records were being relocated to a basement that floods regularly. I rescued a few boxes. This deed was inside, still sealed in its original envelope." "What does it mean for Mr. Carter's case?" Micah was already typing notes. "It means this isn't over," the lawyer replied. "It means there's more land, more history, and more people involved than anyone realized. The Carter story doesn't end in Jefferson County. It's just beginning." As Micah hung up, he stared at his notes, understanding that the victory they'd won was just the first battle in a much longer war for justice. He glanced at the final image of his documentary: Elijah Carter standing tall on his reclaimed land, looking toward the horizon with quiet determination. Some fights spanned generations, and some warriors were born to finish what their ancestors had begun. 3 months after Judge Harlan's arrest, the ripples of the Carter case had transformed into waves of change sweeping across the country. On a crisp autumn morning in Washington, D.C., Elijah Carter stood on the steps of the Capitol, his weathered hands steady as he adjusted his tie. Behind him gathered an assembly of civil rights leaders, legislators, and families whose stories mirrored his own. Attorney General Vanessa Mitchell approached the podium, her voice carrying across the crowded plaza. Today marks the official launch of the Federal Land Back Justice Initiative, a comprehensive program designed to investigate, document, and address historical patterns of racially motivated land theft throughout the United States. Camera flashes punctuated her announcement as she continued. This task force will have unprecedented authority to review judicial decisions, property transfers, and institutional practices dating back to the Reconstruction era. She turned, gesturing to Elijah. Our inspiration for this initiative comes from one man's unwavering fight for justice and the extraordinary revelations that emerged from his case. I am honored to introduce Mr. Elijah Carter, who will receive the first Congressional Medal of Civil Valor for his courage in challenging a corrupt system. Elijah moved slowly to the microphone, the weight of the moment evident in his careful steps. At 78, he had never imagined standing before the nation's capital, his personal struggle now embodied in federal policy. "Thank you, Madam Attorney General," he began, his voice soft but clear. "When I first walked into that courtroom to fight for my family's land, I wasn't looking for revenge or recognition." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I just wanted to be heard. I wanted the truth of my family's story to matter." He looked out over the crowd, finding the faces of those who had stood with him: Amara, Isaiah, Sarah, Micah, Camille, and many others. Today I was heard. We all were heard, and that sound is echoing across this country. As Elijah accepted the medal, the audience rose in a standing ovation. News cameras captured the moment, broadcasting it to viewers nationwide. Among those watching was Judge Theodore Harlan, now inmate 42897, viewing the ceremony on a small television in the prison common room. His expression remained unreadable as guards escorted him back to his cell. Meanwhile, Elijah's victory had inspired a new generation of activists. Camille Rivers, Sarah Wilson, and Isaiah Carter formed the core of a powerful coalition that began working across state lines to reopen cases of suspected judicial fraud. "We're creating a blueprint for communities to challenge corrupt land transfers," Camille explained to a group of law students who had volunteered their time. "The approach that worked in Jefferson County can be adapted anywhere similar patterns emerge." Sarah nodded, adding, "We've already identified over 200 cases in 5 states that show the same signatures of fraud, questionable competency hearings, conflicts of interest, missing evidence." Isaiah, who had taken a leave of absence from his corporate job, demonstrated the database he'd created. "This AI system can analyze court records to detect patterns that human reviewers might miss. It cross-references property transfers, judicial decisions, and corporate development to identify suspicious correlations." The students watched, mesmerized, as the program highlighted clusters of questionable cases across a digital map. "The AI algorithm doesn't just find individual cases," Isaiah explained. "It reveals entire systems of corruption." One student raised her hand. "How are you funding this work?" Camille smiled. "The settlements from Brightwell Development are just the beginning. More companies are negotiating resolutions rather than facing public trials. Those funds go directly into supporting affected families and expanding our investigative capacity." Later that week, in San Francisco, Boston, Atlanta, and dozens of cities between, protesters gathered under a unified banner: "This land is ours." The movement, born from Elijah's case, had grown with remarkable speed. Unlike previous protests focused solely on police brutality or voting rights, this movement addressed the fundamental question of property and intergenerational wealth, the land stolen through legal means across decades. Signs bearing Elijah's image and quotes appeared at rallies. T-shirts and social media profiles featured the simple oak tree symbol that had become the movement's logo, representing roots that could not be severed and growth that could not be stopped. In Chicago, community organizers used the coalition's database to identify 40 properties that had been seized from Black owners through suspect court proceedings, all later developed by the same company. In New Orleans, a neighborhood association discovered that a planned luxury development site contained the unmarked graves of formerly enslaved people, information deliberately concealed during property hearings. Amara traveled constantly, providing legal guidance to emerging community coalitions. After a particularly exhausting week of back-to-back consultations, She returned to her hotel room to find an unexpected message waiting, an offer to become a federal judge, personally endorsed by the president. The position would provide security, prestige, and significant influence within the system. It represented everything she had worked toward throughout her legal career. Amara stared at the letter for a long time, weighing the opportunity against the work still unfinished. The next morning, she called the Justice Department with her decision. "I'm honored by the nomination," she told them. "But my place is on the battlefield, not behind the bench. There are hundreds of communities still fighting for their land and history. I can't step away until this work is further along." The official sounded disappointed, but not surprised. "The offer remains open, Ms. Langston. The country needs judges who understand these issues firsthand." "Someday, perhaps," Amara replied, "but not today." While the legal battles continued, Isaiah's technological approach was yielding unexpected victories. His database had identified suspicious patterns in corporate land acquisitions extending beyond American borders. Working with international researchers, he uncovered Brightwell's involvement in similar schemes in Central America and West Africa. "They used the same playbook globally," he explained to reporters at a press conference. "Find historically marginalized communities with valuable land, exploit legal technicalities to challenge ownership, then leverage corrupt officials to transfer titles." The revelations prompted a massive class action lawsuit against Brightwell's international subsidiaries, further destabilizing what remained of the company. Garrett Brightwell, awaiting trial on multiple federal charges, watched his corporate empire crumble from house arrest in his once palatial home, now heavily mortgaged to cover legal fees. On a personal level, the case had sparked powerful reunions and healing for many involved. Sarah Wilson and her mother, Diana, began the delicate process of rebuilding their relationship after years of estrangement. Their first meetings were awkward, filled with painful silences and unresolved hurt. "He paid me to disappear," Diana admitted during one difficult conversation. "When you turned 18, the payments stopped. He said you'd made your choice by taking my name." Sarah reached across the table to take her mother's hand. "We both deserved better." Diana nodded, tears welling. "I should have fought harder for you." "We're fighting now," Sarah replied. "Not just for us, but for everyone who was silenced." Their healing process became part of Sarah's work with families separated by similar circumstances, children disconnected from parents, siblings lost to each other when properties were seized and communities scattered. Meanwhile, Micah Reed's career had taken off in ways he had never anticipated. His documentary, Land of the Stolen, premiered globally on Netflix, bringing Elijah's story to audiences around the world. The film combined historical analysis with deeply personal narratives, showing how land theft had shaped the economic landscape of modern America. At the premiere, Micah deflected praise to the subjects of his documentary. "I simply pointed the camera where it needed to be pointed," he insisted when awarded a prestigious filmmaking prize. "This story found me. I was just lucky enough to listen." The documentary's success opened doors to previously hidden histories. Viewers came forward with their own family stories, creating a crowdsourced archive of land dispossession that spanned continents and centuries. Amid the growing movement, Elijah maintained his quiet dignity. He split his time between speaking engagements, where his soft-spoken testimony moved audiences to tears, and peaceful days on his reclaimed land. The new house built by community volunteers had become a gathering place, part museum, part community center, part sacred space. One evening, as Elijah sat on his porch watching the sunset, his phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Mr. Carter, this is Thomas Williams, an attorney in Mississippi." The voice sounded young, eager. "I think I found your grandmother's original deed." Elijah's heart quickened. "My grandmother Sarah's deed?" "Yes, sir. And it names her as co-owner of several properties across 3 counties. Properties that, according to the record, were sold after her death, though I can find no legitimate bill of sale." Elijah gripped the phone tighter. "How did you find this?" "I've been following your case, sir. It inspired me to look into similar patterns here in Mississippi. I was searching archive documents scheduled for disposal when I found a sealed envelope with your grandmother's name." And this deed? What does it mean exactly? The lawyer's voice grew more excited. It means your family's legitimate land holdings were much larger than the 3 acres you fought for, and it means the current title holders, including our state governor's family, may have acquired those properties through fraud. After hanging up, Elijah sat motionless, absorbing the implications. His grandmother, Sarah, the woman whose name he had only seen on a handmade wooden grave marker, had left a paper trail that could shake the foundations of Mississippi politics. He immediately called Amara. The Mississippi revelation proved to be the final puzzle piece in a picture far larger than anyone had initially imagined. On a chilly December morning, Amara Langston stood before a room full of journalists, attorneys, and community leaders at the National Press Club. Behind her hung a detailed map of the southeastern United States, with hundreds of properties highlighted in red. What began as one man's fight for 3 acres has uncovered one of the largest organized land theft operations in American history, she announced, her voice steady with controlled anger. The deed discovered in Mississippi archives confirms that the Carter family legally owned over 200 acres across multiple counties, land now controlled by some of the most powerful families in the region, including relatives of the current Mississippi governor. She gestured to the documents displayed on easels around the room. These records establish a clear pattern of fraud spanning multiple generations and crossing state lines. Officials in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and the Carolinas colluded to systematically erase black land ownership through coordinated legal manipulation. The evidence was irrefutable: notarized deeds, altered court records, forged bills of sale, all connecting to a network of judges, bank officials, and politicians who had enriched themselves at the expense of black landowners. The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking, involving dozens of public officials across several states. This isn't just corruption, Amara concluded. This is the deliberate engineering of racial wealth disparities that persist to this day. The land taken from the Carter family alone would be worth approximately $40 million at current market values. The press conference triggered immediate political earthquakes. The Mississippi governor held an emergency meeting with his legal team. Federal investigators launched probes into judicial conduct across the region. Class action lawsuits multiplied as more families came forward with similar documentation. For Elijah, however, the expanded legal battle was secondary to a more personal quest. Armed with the newly discovered deed, Isaiah and a team of volunteers began searching for the original boundaries of his grandmother's property, land that included not just farmland, but a small creek, timberland, and a hilltop that local history suggested had spiritual significance. On a clear winter morning, Elijah gathered with family members and supporters at the edge of his property. Old maps in hand, they began walking the perimeter described in Sarah Carter's original deed, boundaries that extended far beyond the 3 acres he had fought to save. Behind a dense thicket of brambles and young trees, Isaiah made a discovery that stopped them all in their tracks. Half buried in the earth, weathered by more than a century of seasons, stood a small headstone carved from local stone. Careful clearing revealed the name: Sarah Ellen Carter, 1845-1912. She kept the faith. Elijah knelt beside the grave, his fingers tracing the worn letters of his grandmother's name. "This is why they wanted this section so badly," he said softly. "They knew the graves would prove continuous occupancy." The discovery provided irrefutable physical evidence supporting the deed's authenticity. More importantly for Elijah, it restored a crucial connection to his family's past. A grandmother whose story had been partially erased, now reclaimed through both documentation and physical presence. Meanwhile, in a federal prison outside Atlanta, Theodore Harlan sat across from his attorney, reviewing the terms of a new plea agreement. The discovery of the broader conspiracy had increased pressure on prosecutors to secure his complete cooperation. "They're offering reduced sentencing in exchange for your testimony against officials in Mississippi and Georgia," his lawyer explained. "Full disclosure of all parties involved in the land acquisition schemes." Harlan stared at the documents, without speaking. The man who had once commanded a courtroom with his presence now seemed diminished, his shoulders hunched, his once precisely trimmed hair growing out unevenly. "What choice do I have?" he finally asked, his voice hollow. None. If you want any chance of seeing freedom again in your lifetime. Later that week, Harlan began a series of depositions that would eventually implicate 3 federal judges, 7 state legislators, and dozens of local officials in the multi-state conspiracy. The man who had once protected the system at all costs became the key to exposing its rotten core. As federal investigations expanded, communities across the South began their own processes of reckoning and healing. On Elijah's restored property, he organized a ceremony that drew hundreds of descendants of displaced families from across the region. At dusk, they gathered in a large circle around the family cemetery. Each person held a candle and a small card, bearing the name of an ancestor who had lost land through fraud or coercion. One by one, they stepped forward, speaking the names aloud and sharing brief stories of what had been taken. James Washington, 1872-1945, 40 acres in Lowndes County. Mary and Joseph Turner, 1890-1962, 1885-1968, 15 acres and a mill in Camden County. William Jackson, 1863-1940, 60 acres in Greene County. As darkness fell, the circle of lights grew more beautiful and profound, each flame representing a life and legacy that corrupt systems had tried to extinguish, now rekindled in memory and justice. Elijah spoke last, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. My great-grandfather Moses fought for his freedom, then worked this land with hands scarred by chains. My grandfather Joseph built a home here and taught his children to read by lamplight. My father Harold died believing he had failed to protect what they built. He paused, emotion thickening his voice. Tonight we restore not just their names but their dignity. This ceremony is not an ending but a beginning, the start of a truth that can no longer be buried or stolen. In the months that followed, the discoveries in Mississippi led to further revelations. Using ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists identified dozens of unmarked graves on land now owned by commercial developments and private estates. DNA testing confirmed these were the ancestors of families who had claimed wrongful displacement. 3. Evidence forced reluctant legislators to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused specifically on land theft. Unlike previous commissions that had offered only symbolic acknowledgement, this one had the power to recommend property transfers and financial restitution. For Judge Theodore Harlan, the final humiliation came when his jail cell television showed coverage of the dismantling of his legacy. The courthouse where he had presided for decades was renamed the Justice Restoration Center, dedicated to reviewing cases of judicial misconduct. His portrait was removed from the building's lobby, replaced by a memorial to families who had suffered under biased rulings. The man who had once been feared and respected now sat alone, watching his name become synonymous with corruption, his life's work unraveled thread by thread. While Harlan faded into obscurity, Elijah's relationship with his grandson Isaiah deepened through their shared purpose. One evening, as they reviewed maps of newly identified Carter family properties, Isaiah expressed the regret that had been weighing on him. I wasted so many years away from here, he confessed. I thought success meant leaving all this behind. Elijah placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. You came back when it mattered most. You didn't just save the land, Isaiah. You saved all of us. The technical skills Isaiah had developed in his corporate career had proven essential to unraveling the complex web of fraud. His database had become a national resource, helping hundreds of families trace their lost properties and build cases for restitution. Grandma Ruby would be proud of you, Elijah added softly. She always said you'd find your way home eventually. Sarah Wilson, meanwhile, had found her voice as a powerful advocate for children affected by hidden histories. At a youth conference in Atlanta, she stood before hundreds of teenagers, many from families similar to her own. I was raised in silence, she told them, her voice steady and clear. My father, Judge Harlan, kept me hidden because my existence contradicted the image he wanted to project. My black mother was paid to stay quiet. She paused, meeting the eyes of young people listening intently. When I discovered the truth about my father's corruption, I had a choice: continue the silence or speak the truth. I chose truth, and that saved me, not just from him but from becoming like him. Her story resonated deeply, especially with young people struggling with complex family histories. The Reclamation Foundation she had established now offered scholarships, counseling, and legal assistance to children caught in similar circumstances. As the anniversary of Judge Harlan's arrest approached, Amara received an unexpected letter, delivered to her office. The envelope bore no return address, but the official Justice Department seal suggested its importance. Inside was a brief note and a confidential case file. "Ms. Langston, you're not done. We need you in Chicago." The attached file contains evidence of judicial corruption affecting housing rights in multiple districts. The next case is even bigger than Carter vs. Harlan. A friend within the system, Amara, studied the enclosed documents, recognizing patterns similar to those she had uncovered in Jefferson County, but on a much larger scale. The corruption extended into federal housing programs, affecting thousands of families across multiple cities. She immediately began making calls, assembling a team that now had experience dismantling such systems. The movement that had begun with Elijah's 3 acres was expanding into a national reckoning with the legal structures that had enabled generations of dispossession. Spring returned to Elijah's land, bringing new life and renewed purpose. The Mayan rebuilt house gleamed in the morning light. The young oak he had planted by the family cemetery had survived its first winter, small green leaves unfurling with promise. Community gatherings had become regular events on the property. Elijah had established an educational center where schoolchildren learned about land rights, legal history, and the importance of documentation. In a converted barn, volunteers digitized family records brought by community members, creating an archive of ownership that could never again be easily erased. On a particularly beautiful morning, Elijah sat under the shade of an old magnolia tree, watching a group of children plant a vegetable garden under Isaiah's guidance. Each child took turns digging small holes, placing seeds, and carefully covering them with soil, learning through direct experience how to tend the earth. Elijah's mind drifted back through the generations of his family, who had worked this same soil, their hands performing these same ancient gestures of cultivation and care. Through all the legal battles, political maneuvering, and media attention, this simple connection to the land remained the heart of everything he had fought to protect. A young girl approached, holding out a handful of sunflower seeds. "Mr. Carter, would you like to plant some too?" Elijah smiled, accepting the seeds and rising slowly to his feet. With practiced movements, his weathered hands worked the soil, creating a perfect depth for the seeds that would become towering flowers by summer's end. As the sun climbed higher, Elijah straightened and looked out over the property, past the rebuilt house, beyond the family cemetery with its old and new markers, across fields that had sustained his family for generations. In the distance, he could see new survey stakes marking portions of land that would soon be formally returned to Carter family ownership. He smiled, content in the knowledge that what had been stolen through generations of deceit had been reclaimed through generations of persistence. The truth, once buried, had finally broken through to the light. Have we created a world where justice is merely a privilege for the powerful? Or can one person's courage inspire a movement that changes the system forever? What generational wounds in your own community still wait to be healed? Like and subscribe for more stories that expose the shadows of our past and illuminate paths toward a more just future.